This idea that military force, that sabotage, can be used to effectively contain or roll back or restrain Iran's nuclear activities really isn't borne out by history.
That's the voice of Kelsey Davenport, Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, I believe there was some nuclear news in Congress last week?
Hi, Michelle. Yes, last week saw the reintroduction of the No First Use Act in Congress by Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Adam Smith, chair of the House Armed Services Committee. We are hoping this bill gains support and has an impact on the Biden administration, which will be reviewing U.S. nuclear policy later this year.
And what do you have lined up for us on Early Warning?
Today, we dive into the Biden administration's announcement to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan by September 11th. The decision highlights how the administration is shifting U.S. foreign policy away from anti-terrorism campaigns that dominated the post-9/11 world to current national security priorities. And we're looking at why the Biden administration made this decision and what it means for the future of U.S. military interventions. So please stay tuned for today's Early Warning.
After that, I sit down with Kelsey Davenport, who's the Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. We talk about the ongoing negotiations going on about the Iran deal in Vienna, and we discuss the implications of Iran's announcement about increasing uranium enrichment up to 60% following an attack on its Natanz facility. She gives us the latest news of what's going on and what to watch for in the coming weeks, both in Vienna and here in the United States. So you really don't want to miss it.
Finally, we answer a question about arms control between U.S. and China on this week's Q&A segment. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Before we get into today's show, I just want to take a minute to mark the passing of Dr. Vartan Gregorian, the president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. He was an incredible philanthropic leader in the peace and security space, ardent supporter of education and immigration causes. And he had a special impact on the nuclear field through his leadership and funding at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So if you have a moment, I hope you take that coffee break to read more about his life and what he left behind. We're really going to miss him. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. President Biden has announced that all U.S. troops will come home from Afghanistan by September 11th, after 20 long years of war. The president said that the main objectives of the war had been met long ago, and that it is time to end the forever war. Biden also said that once al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden had been found a decade ago, the reasons for remaining in Afghanistan have become increasingly unclear. On the show today, we have Adam Weinstein, research fellow at the Quincy Institute. Adam served as a U.S. Marine and deployed to Afghanistan in 2012. Adam, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Adam, your organization has applauded the Biden administration for its decision to leave Afghanistan. Tell us why.
The reason we've applauded the Biden administration for this decision is because it's a recognition that U.S. troops on the ground don't offer a viable solution for what is essentially a civil war. And it would be a mistake to transition from the last 20 years of a failed counterinsurgency that sought to use U.S. troops to militarily defeat the Taliban to another decade of using the U.S. troops to try to enforce or coerce a peace agreement, And I think proponents of keeping the boots on the ground have transitioned from their justification, which was initially a total military defeat of the Taliban. And now their argument is this idea that we can dictate a peace agreement. And the problem with that is the common denominator remains the use of the US military to achieve these outcomes that we don't ultimately have control over.
Got it. And of course, you heard many responding to the decision by saying that things will now get worse in Afghanistan. What is your response to that?
Well, my response is they're correct. Things will get worse. We've always been clear-eyed about that. What we're doing is we're changing the dynamics on the ground. And whenever you do that, there's going to be violence. But what the proponents of keeping US troops there just a little bit longer, which inevitably turns into years, don't grapple with is the costs of staying. And the costs of staying are to kick the can down the road and essentially bleed the country slowly. And we keep our thumbs on the scale by staying, and other regional actors like Pakistan have their thumbs on the scale. But the reality is that these regional countries like Pakistan and the Taliban have more staying power than the United States does. So unless the Taliban calculate that US troops will remain in Afghanistan indefinitely, and by indefinitely, I very much literally mean perhaps not forever, but for decades and decades to come. I don't mean 2 years. The leverage that US troops provide in the short term will not translate into the kinds of compromises that would be needed for a sustainable peace deal. And if we look at peace deals historically, most of them fail in the implementation phase. And for them to even have a chance at success, there usually has to be a third-party mediator and a third party that will enforce the peace agreement if it's breached. Well, the United States can't play that role because the United States is a party to the conflict, which too many people in the Beltway forget. We weren't simply a UN peacekeeping force on the sideline. We were actively involved. So my answer to your initial question is things will get worse if we leave, but they would have gotten worse anyway. And I think there's a very low chance that a peace agreement is reached if the US withdraws. But I think there was close to zero chance or zero chance that it would have been reached if the US stayed. And in terms of the capabilities of the ANDSF and the viability of the Afghan government, we'll see what happens. It could be the case that a US withdrawal increases the resolve of the Afghan military to fight now that they don't have the crutch of the United States. And of course, we're not advocating for a disengagement from Afghanistan. It's pretty essential that the United States continue to support the Afghan security forces with resources. Of course, those resources should come with strings attached. It's crucial that corruption is not allowed to run rampant and that the Afghan security forces don't violate the rights of Afghans. But so long as the ANDSF can, be a responsible recipient of U.S. military aid, I think that should continue.
Got it. And let's broaden the aperture a little bit. What might this tell us about the Biden administration's future plans? Is this the beginning of the end of U.S. military interventions, say in Iraq and Syria?
Well, it should be the beginning of a rethink in the way the United States approaches foreign policy. It would be a real shame if the experience of Afghanistan and the lessons learned were siloed off and only applied retroactively in this one case. But this is one of the problems with the conversation in the Beltway, which is that, everybody can agree in the abstract that forever wars should end, or that we need a more narrow authorization for the use of military force, or that Afghanistan was mismanaged. But when it comes to applying these lessons in the moment and in the future, that's a lot more difficult. And I think there's this sort of bias towards action versus inaction. And I'm talking about military action here. And we've become, in some sense, addicted to the delusion of the quick results that a military intervention provides, because genuine diplomacy, real sustainable development, and sustainable aid takes years. But the great thing about changes that are made through diplomacy and through sustainable development and aid is that they're not so easily reversed. I mean, we have former military commanders saying that the moment 3,500 US troops leave Afghanistan, all the gains of the last 20 years are going to be undone. So what does that say about the effectiveness of US military interventions versus diplomacy and aid? I think it's a very damning indictment of U.S. military interventions. And it's actually being said by the people who led those interventions. And of course, they're trying to make a different point, but they're inadvertently making a point that I think is contrary to their calls for keeping boots on the ground.
Adam, our time is up. I want to thank you so much for being here and wish you all the best for your work going forward.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Warner, and I'm the managing director of Plowshares Fund. Even though I've been working in the nuclear field for nearly 9 years, there is still so much to learn. That's why I'm a dedicated listener of Press the Button. I so appreciate each episode where I can get the top stories of the week and a deeper dive into critical conversations with thought leaders and experts in nuclear policy and national security. I'm also a proud supporter of Plowshares Fund. Did you know that many of the guests featured on Press the Button are supported by Plowshares? Since our founding 40 years ago, all of our work is made possible by individuals just like you. Curious, committed, passionate. If you like what you're hearing on Press the Button and want to support the work of Plowshares Fund, please donate today. Whether it's $5, $50, $500, your generosity helps create a safer future free from the threat of nuclear weapons. Visit plowshares.org today to make a donation. Or join me and make it monthly. Whatever you do, stay informed, stay safe, and stay connected. Together, we can create a world where nuclear weapons can never be used again. Thank you for listening.
Kelsey Davenport is the Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, where she focuses on the nuclear and missile programs in Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and on international efforts to prevent proliferation and nuclear terrorism. You may have seen Kelsey quoted in the media. She's been in numerous publications, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, many more, and has provided commentary on NPR, CNN, ABC, MSNBC, Fox News, and C-SPAN. She is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the National Committee on North Korea. And we are thrilled to have her on the show during this very busy week. Kelsey, thank you for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Iran announced this week that it would begin enriching uranium up to 60% following an attack on the Natanz facility that damaged its centrifuges. What are the implications, both from a non-proliferation perspective and from a political messaging perspective?
So Iran has threatened to enrich up to 60% uranium in the past. They did so prior to the negotiations on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Actions. And they did so actually just a few months ago, saying that this is a step they might take if the United States does not return to the agreement and waive sanctions. But this is the first time they've actually followed through on this threat. And Iran just confirmed today, Friday, that they actually produced some uranium enriched to that level. So not only have they started, but they've actually begun to enrich and produce 60% enriched material. So this is a new acquisition of knowledge for Iran. It's a new milestone. But in terms of how much impact this is actually going to have on the risk posed by their program, it really is too soon to tell. I mean, Iran is using a limited number of advanced centrifuges to enrich to 60%. And if it were to accumulate a lot of material enriched to 60%, that would reduce the breakout time or the time it would take them to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. But, we have to take into account that while Iran has this new enrichment level, this new capability, it's also lost a lot of capacity because of the attack on Natanz. So it's really too soon to say how this development will play out in terms of proliferation risk. Certainly, the decision to enrich to 60% and to do that quickly sends a strong political signal. I think Iran is messaging both to Israel, who's likely behind the attack, and to the other parties that are part of the nuclear deal with Iran and the United States, that it's going to continue to ratchet up its activities if sanctions relief isn't granted, and it will follow through on that threat. But I think Iran is also trying to temper the politics of this announcement. I mean, interestingly enough, they decided to enrich to 60% in their pilot plant at Natanz. This is a small facility. It's above ground. So essentially, it would be pretty easy to target in a military strike. Also, just given the small size of the facility, Iran isn't going to be able to really ratchet up at 60% activities if it's confining it to that space. So I think they're sending a political signal that they won't be bullied, that they'll continue to take action to build leverage with their nuclear program if the nuclear deal isn't restored, but also sending a signal at the same time that this isn't about pursuing a bomb.
So what do we know about the attack and the extent of the damage?
Well, there's not a lot that we know about the damage yet. I mean, what appears to have happened is that the power supply for the main fuel enrichment plant at Natanz was attacked. And not only was the power supply damaged, but it seems to have taken Iran some time to get the emergency backup power restored to that facility. So that has an impact on the centrifuges that are installed there. I mean, centrifuges aren't like lamps. If the power goes off, you plug it back in and it works just fine. I mean, you can't, flick a switch on a centrifuge to just turn it back on. So Iran is going to have to go through centrifuge by centrifuge and inspect these machines for damage. Now, at Natanz, there are just over 5,000 IR-1 first generation centrifuges, and Iran has installed, upwards of 1,000 advanced centrifuges. Now, not all of these may have been working at the time, but certainly, Iran is going to have to look at each one. And Iranian officials have said that there may be thousands of centrifuges that were damaged. So it does seem to have had a significant impact at that facility.
And this is just the latest in a series of attacks over the years on Iran's nuclear program, including assassinations of its nuclear scientists, other cyber attacks. All of them, of course, have had appear to have had the intent of slowing down the program, but what has the impact been of these attacks?
I think this most recent attack and Iran's response to it, ratcheting up to 60%, is part of a pattern that we've seen, that Iran reacts to attacks on its nuclear program, whether those are, physical attacks like the attack in Natanz or some of the cyber attacks we've seen in the past, or the targeting of its scientists, by ratcheting up its nuclear activities. And that's why I think this idea that military force, that sabotage, can be used to effectively, contain or roll back or restrain Iran's nuclear activities really isn't borne out by history. I mean, what history really shows us is that these attacks may set Iran's program back, but the setbacks are temporary, and Iran usually responds by ratcheting up its activities even further. So there is no sabotage response to address Iran's nuclear activities. There's no military response to address Iran's activities. Diplomacy is the only way to put in lasting limits and monitoring to provide assurance that Iran's program is peaceful.
So there are several states who are not at the negotiating table, but who have a keen interest in the outcome, most prominently Israel and Saudi Arabia. Israel, of course, is the alleged perpetrator of the recent attacks. How else do you expect these states to try to influence the negotiations?
Right now, we're seeing a lot of replays that we saw in 2015 when the nuclear deal was being debated and discussed here in the United States. And we're seeing a lot of attempts by the Israelis in particular to try to influence the narrative about the nuclear deal and to make the arguments that the nuclear deal isn't strong enough, that it's not effective enough. But the history of the nuclear deal hasn't borne that out. For the 2 years that the deal was fully implemented, it was demonstrably effective and verifiable. And not only do we have a history of International Atomic Energy Agency reports demonstrating Iran's compliance, but we have a history of U.S. intelligence community reports demonstrating Iran's compliance, demonstrating the benefits of the deal, and stating quite equivocally, including this past week, that Iran has not resumed those critical activities necessary to pursue a nuclear weapon. So the deal works. But, despite that, again, we're seeing attempts by the Israelis, by some of the Gulf states to try to disrupt those negotiations. And that's what I think is important to remember, is that this act of sabotage is not just directed at Iran's nuclear program. It's directed at the Biden administration and the Biden administration's plan to try to restore the nuclear deal with Iran and then use that as a basis for future talks. So I think, we should expect to see these types of actions, these types of rhetoric in particular, to continue. But what's critical is that the United States and Iran remain focused on restoring the nuclear deal. They remain focused on the talks in Vienna. And ideally, we see some more condemnation of the act of sabotage that we saw earlier this week. And I think that's one of the really disappointing takeaways that I have from the last few days, is that we've seen the Europeans come out and condemn Iran for enriching to 60%. We've seen the US condemn Iran for enriching to 60%. But we haven't seen that same strident condemnation of the decision to attack an Iranian nuclear facility. And I think that unfortunately sends the wrong message that these types of attacks will be tolerated and that there are no consequences for a country like Israel if they choose to engage in these types of activities in the future. So essentially, Iran, keeps getting the message that Israel will reach out, it will touch Iran's nuclear program, whenever it chooses with little consequence. And I think that's, a very unfortunate takeaway from this experience that the United States needs to try to counter with its rhetoric and actions down the road.
You mentioned them. How are the talks in Vienna going?
Well, I will admit, I was worried about how the Natanz attacks and the move to 60% was going to impact the resumption of discussions in Vienna about how to restore the nuclear deal. I was concerned that we might see a hardening of the Iranian position, or that there would be, such a focus on, the rhetoric, Iran's outrage over the attacks, that it might distract from some of the critical discussions that need to happen to return to the deal. And thus far, after about 2 days of discussions, it doesn't appear that that's the case. I mean, fortunately, both Iran and the United States and the other parties to the deal seem to be very focused on talking through the steps necessary to return to compliance with the accord. I mean, right now, it seems like we're at the point where both on the nuclear activity side and the sanctions lifting side, the working groups are going through and they're looking at, the very specific sanctions that would need to be removed to restore compliance with the JCPOA, and the very specific actions Iran would need to take to return to compliance. And I think that that's critical because this is essentially what Iran said it wanted out of this process. It wanted a comprehensive look at what restoration of the deal would look like. It wanted to know specifically what sanctions the U.S. would be willing to lift, not just those specified in the JCPOA, but those imposed by Trump that were explicitly designed to make restoring the JCPOA more difficult. So seeing that full picture, I think will help give Iran confidence that the Biden administration is serious about fully implementing the JCPOA and serious about sanctions relief. So the fact that the fact that the parties are engaged in these very detailed discussions, these very specific questions, I view that as positive. I mean, certainly, we're not out of the woods yet. It sounds like negotiations are going to continue. There's going to be another break and then the parties will come back. So I still think there are a lot of difficult technical questions that will need to be resolved. There's going to be some difficult political decisions that need to be made. But I'm optimistic that we're on the right track and that both the United States and Iran remain focused on that goal of restoring the deal because it ultimately benefits both sides.
It is so hard for those on the outside sometimes to know what's going on as, negotiators disappear into these rooms and closed doors. What are you watching for? What are the things that if you see come out of these talks are going to give you that continued optimism that we're on the right track?
Well, I think one signal that's important is just that talks continue at this point. I mean, Iran has made quite clear that it's willing to walk away from the table and continue ratcheting up its nuclear program if it doesn't feel like the Biden administration is serious. So right now, I think the fact that talks are ongoing, that they're continuing, is certainly very positive. I also, as I said, I view the fact that the discussions have moved on to these specific questions to also be, encouraging. I mean, if the United States and Iran are beginning to get into that level of detail and that level of granularity, I mean, it would generally seem like conversations have progressed to get to that point, where these specifics can be discussed. So the continuation of talks, the continuation of these detailed discussions, I think all of that is quite positive.
Do you have any recommendations, whether for the negotiators or the policymakers who are on the receiving end of these things as they continue this process?
I think that's a great question, because I think the influence of domestic politics is often overlooked when considering the challenges of returning to compliance with the nuclear deal. I mean, President Biden has the authority to waive all of these sanctions. He does not need the U.S. Congress to weigh in and approve any sanctions lifting. But the fact that there are prominent voices in the Democratic Party that are throwing up roadblocks and challenging the Biden administration's approach to Iran, I think is very troubling. I mean, President Biden's plan, is the best way forward. It restores limits and monitoring on Iran's nuclear program now, heading off, what would likely become a nuclear crisis if the deal isn't restored. And it sets the table for future talks on a range of issues. Now, there are critics of that approach, within the Democratic Party. I mean, Senator Menendez recently co-led with Senator Graham a letter from a group of senators essentially calling for the United States to try to negotiate with Iran, a comprehensive deal, nuclear, missiles, regional, all at once, using the additional sanctions that Trump put in place over the past few years. But the sanctions regime that Trump imposed, this isn't real leverage because the United States has no credibility to wield it. And that's why I think, Biden's approach, is the smart one. I mean, I recognize, understand, and share a number of the concerns articulated by Senator Menendez and others. We need to think about the future of Iran's nuclear program after certain limits expire. We need a better strategy for security in the region. We need to think about ballistic missile proliferation. But the path to those issues, to sitting down and discussing those issues with Iran, that runs through restoring the JCPOA and beginning to rebuild the U.S. credibility.
Kelsey, thank you so much for coming on. We will continue to follow this closely, and I'm sure we will be calling you back to get a better understanding of where we are.
Thanks so much for having me.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now for everyone's favorite nuclear question and answer. This week, we have Senior Program Officer at Plowshares Fund, Dr. John Carl Baker, here to answer the question. Are you ready, John Carl?
I'm ready. Sure. Go ahead.
This week's question comes from Hiroaki in Japan. Hiroaki asks, how can the U.S. incentivize China for arms control cooperation and negotiation for new architectures, such as a post-INF treaty framework or a doctrine that develops common vocabulary to avoid miscommunication?
Well, this is a great question, and it's certainly one that a lot of policymakers in Washington are thinking about right now. And there are reasons for concern. China's modernizing its arsenal. Its total number of warheads has ticked up recently. And there's a risk of a confrontation over Taiwan or the South China Sea, maybe not now, but potentially in the future. So we should be talking about engaging China and trying to find ways to incentivize them. So I came up with a couple of suggestions here, and I'm going to give three. The first one is acknowledge the huge disparity in warheads. China has said they won't talk about arms control with the U.S. until the U.S. comes down to its level of arsenal. And frankly, this response is kind of understandable. To put this in perspective, the U.S. has 5 times as many warheads deployed, that's just the deployed warheads, as China has in total. And China's warheads, they have about 350. None of them are even actually deployed. They don't keep their warheads mated with their missiles in the same way that we do. So there's just this massive disparity between the levels. And the US has to acknowledge that we have real room to move here and that our huge arsenal is a problem. And so I think part of what we need to do up front is just acknowledge that the Chinese have legitimate concerns there and that that's a real issue that we need to talk about. The second one is put missile defense on the table. Chinese officials have repeatedly expressed concern over US missile defense, but so far, no US administration has been willing to talk about it. And I found a quote from Tong Zhao, who's a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment. He was writing this late last year. And he said, China's concern over US missile defense, if left unaddressed, would remain the strongest external driver of its comprehensive nuclear modernization. It's a direct quote. So if we're concerned about China's expanding capabilities, then we have to be willing to trade something to get them under control. And if missile defense is the main thing driving their modernization, why wouldn't we put something on the table to try to get those capabilities under control? This is the thing that's causing the risk in the first place. So we need to be willing, and we should be willing, it makes logical sense, to put it on the table and try to get China to limit their capabilities a little bit. It makes sense, but yet no US administration has been willing to do so. And the last one is, if we can't do these other things up front, it may be easiest to start with strategic stability talks. In other words, talking about risk reduction between the US and China. This would involve acknowledging that China is a major power, that it has really extensive and advanced nuclear capabilities, and that neither side wants a nuclear miscalculation, for instance, over an issue related to Taiwan. So we need to get together and talk about the ways to at least reduce the risk of a nuclear escalation. These talks often don't involve major policy change. They aren't arms control talks in the usual sense, but they're a way for both sides to get together and try to make it less likely that there is any sort of nuclear accident. So those will be my three recommendations. This is definitely a major issue, and it's a great question. I'm glad it was asked.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Hiroaki, for the question, and thanks, John Carl, for coming on. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Derek Sender, Will Lowry, and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.